Just because we've lost our bearings, what gives you the right to say that we've run out of alternatives?
He demanded of his opponent.
First of all, who says we're lost? Quite the opposite. We could at long last be arriving. What I am saying is that all you can offer is just one more fiction.
That sense of things, now so freely spoken of being deceived, disorientated, adrift, plagued by too many unfinished stories. Once there was rhyme and there was reason, they said. You were home and there was a way. But for some, when a system of beliefs breaks down, it's as if words in a dictionary are slipping around, unable to get a grip. Well, that's the new freedom, others say. So what if meanings just evaporate and reality is at best only virtual? Who cares for all those old questions? It's not the first time nor the last that the world feels as if it's been turned upside down. We're in between times, that's all. We're catching our second breath. It's always been the same and we've come out of it. But what if this puzzling present was really different? What then? That's the question that both of them, in their fond old age, had to come to grips with. It could have started in any of their usual haunts or places in between. The two of them, let's call them A and Z, for they're not quite fictional characters, had been arguing as long as I can remember. But now they both agreed that the time had come to make certain decisions. It's not clear just what brought things to a head. Their arguments in the past had been more like a ritual combat. This time, however, their argument had somehow wandered over the safe borders of mutual understanding. They were talking about politics, redemption and politics. It had all started with the story of a mine.
So yeah, that's what we'd have had here. With a lot of hard work and a lot of pain, no doubt, but that's what we'd have got, a pit, which is what everybody wanted when they put the £4,000 in. Now, as you can see, there's nothing, and there's no prospects of there being anything on this particular site or within the locality at all. I mean, this place here for 70 years was mining coal, and that was a pit. And now, as you can see, unless I told you it was a pit, you wouldn't have a clue what this was. You'd think you were on the moon or something.
The two of them had just come through their occasional 9 o'clock world tour. It was one of those cold winter evenings, and mesmerised by a feeling that they could not grasp, let alone act upon any of the matters they had just witnessed, they just sat there in a puzzled silence. Untangling these images, they agreed at least on one thing, that once, in the past, there had been a dream. That all those unpredictable forces which made society vulnerable to disorder could be squeezed out, quelled, by rational management, knowledge, science, a sense of the common good. They agreed that the chaos which they had just witnessed was a testimony to the collapse of this dream. But as to the consequences of this, on this question they found themselves in fundamental disagreement. History was what A always latched onto when he thought of what this collapse was leading to. He couldn't help himself. However much he wanted to run away from it, he felt it was always there, behind him, or, to be more precise, in front of him. Zed mocked him for his timidity, his fears, his innate conservatism. It was at this point that A introduced the story of the miners, and how, amidst all this chaos,
something of that old dream was being redeemed.
We knew the mines were profitable. There were vast reserves and vast life being sterilised underground. We decided to take matters into our own hands. It was quite simple, really. Instead of relying on British coal, we decided to take over the mine and put it back into true public ownership.
Why are you telling me this story when you started with the pit destroyed?
Because it's a story of what is still possible, and how old dreams can spring up again when you least expect them.
We have got to negotiate things like the surface buildings, what tipping rights we need around the colliery, which I'm hoping is only going to take about 4 or 5 weeks. Once that is being agreed, is we sign everything up, and the company owns Thatcherism Colliery, and we can get the rest of the workforce in to prepare the pit for production.
What we've done in the past week... We met in the Miners' Welfare Hall on the Sunday, and by the Thursday of that week, we'd actually got 140 miners who'd committed £4,000 of the redundancy money into the company's coffers, and we could go to British Coal on that Friday and make them an offer for the company with over £500,000 in the bank. And this is the offer we made them. We actually offered them, for doing nothing, we offered them nearly £500,000 a year to let us cut coal and run this mine as a mine worker-owned company. They would have got 90 pence for every tonne of coal cut, up to £1.10 once we started to become really productive.
My hopes are that we'd have the possibility of running a colliery where people will be getting a fair day's wage in as good a conditions as you can expect in British deep mine coal. There's all kinds of possibilities you could envisage if you got control over sufficient control over the company. You could get the company to invest in local nurseries. You'd be in a position, if the company had the money, to be ploughing a significant amount of money back into the community, not just in terms of wages, but in other ways as well.
A vision of the future, a rebirth of an old socialist ideal. A large claim, I admit, but even if all this is nothing more than a sign, it shows that its history is not dead. By reclaiming control, something of what socialism has promised can be redeemed.
Well, you may need to interpret this story in terms of socialism and redemption, but for me, that's the curse of the political dreamer. That is, you take a small local story, you try and conjure something hopeful out of it, then you elevate it to the status of a myth. They're after their jobs, not redemption or socialism. Whether you like it or not, those old embracing stories with their hymns of redemption, faith and discipline no longer carry any conviction. I'll admit that for all of us in the past, those old dream songs held us together, gave us a sense of things, order, tasks, futures, and it's something of a shock to be without them. But there it is. Everything points to the end of that history. When you ask what ground we can build hope on, the answer has to be on some other basis than the riddle of history solved. The real riddle of history is that it has no purpose. Look, you're here. They're there. The gap is unbridgeable.
Zed's reply brought a strange echo to A's mind. He couldn't help remembering a row they'd had back in 1984, when they had argued about what the striking miners were actually fighting to conserve.
The miners' battle is bigger than just one of pit closures. Can't you see that the miners are calling us back to values of community and solidarity that you thought had vanished?
Why is it that you always make out that community is such a good thing, like an assembly of angels? Communities can also be conservative, suffocating, self-serving, and narrow-minded.
A remembered that whilst he had listened to Zed's exasperated refusal to endorse the striking miners' strategy, he had doodled a hangman's rope on the table. The previous night, He had seen the striking miners put a hangman's noose over Norman Willis's head. He remembered then feeling that all was lost. He remembered everyone shouting, fit to burst their lungs, but the words were thin, unconvincing. For the government had raised the stakes so high that nothing less than a revolution would do. A admitted to himself privately that it was no longer possible for him and his allies to change the course of history. A new era, whether they liked it or not, was being ushered in. And yet, 8 years later, after that defeat, he now felt ready to pick up that story again, rejoin that history and push it once more for all it was worth.
By early July, the thing was starting to come together, and there was an enormous wave of optimism throughout the village. People were coming to us from all over the country, wanted to know what we were doing and wanted to know how, in similar circumstances, they could do the same. So, I mean, Thurcroft wasn't by any means a panacea, but certainly a lot of people seemed to see it as a route out of the decline that British coal was promoting.
Well, over the last 3 weeks we've been paying for care and maintenance at Thurcroft at £20,000 a week to stop British coal filling the shafts. 2 weeks ago we agreed the bid for the lease and the licence, but recently British coal have come back to us saying that that bid is not agreed and that they had made a mistake and they want an extra 40 pence per tonne from the company on the royalties and the licence, which we obviously have turned down and told British coal that they're not acting in good faith and that we're not prepared to pay for care and maintenance on that footing.
Why do you think the coal board are doing this?
I think that what British coal are trying to do is delay the agreement on the royalties and the licence and try to bleed the company dry.
Can we go further?
We can't go any further. Is that even though the company has its own workforce in, is that British coal still own the land and that they won't allow us onto the premises.
But you put the money in.
That's right, is that our men are still in it at Thurcroft, but under British coal's supervision.
Things started to go wrong, I think, at the point British coal knew that we'd got something. British coal obviously didn't want 200 of their ex-employees to actually start up and run a mine that they'd cast aside after putting £10 million in. And that's where British coal really started to put the obstacles in the way. While we were negotiating, British coal demanded that we pay them over £20,000 a week maintenance to keep the mine shaft open. We thought this was absolutely extortionate, but at the end of the day we had to concede their demands if our company wanted to go in and work the mine.
They certainly made it quite clear to us at our last meeting that now the buyout would take at least another 3 months. That would be a cost of approximately £250,000 to the miners. And in my own mind, I can't ask the miners to risk any more of the redundancy money. I'm sure that 90% of the miners actually possibly would risk more of the redundancy money, but I don't think it's right to ask them to do that when there's no guarantee that British coal will give us the pit. End of the day, it's. I do think it's the end, yes.
Thank you for your letter of the 19th of August about the future of Thurcroft Colliery. You have mentioned the government's commitment to enabling the workforce to enjoy a stake in the future of the coal industry. However, this pledge specifically referred to the privatisation of the coal industry. Government decisions on the structure of the privatised industry have yet to be taken. I do fully recognise the effort and initiative the miners and local community have put into seeking to secure the future of Thurcroft Colliery. I believe, however, that British Coal have done all they can to meet the consortium's needs and concerns, I can well understand the sense of disappointment of all concerned as the project comes to an end. However, I am afraid I have to re-emphasise the point that decisions about Faircroft are matters for British Coal and not the government. Tim Edgar, Department of Trade and Industry, Coal Minister.
And so they failed, and it was painful to see. But look as to why there still is a story. What you don't see is that privatisation can have two heads. One is the straight transfer of state capital into private hands. The other, admittedly full of dangers, is that it could allow socialists to organise production themselves.
Forget it. In my experience, when socialists take over production, they behave worse than capitalists and are not as efficient.
Now it's you who's drowning in the past. What I'm arguing is that by even thinking about these questions, it could at least signal that there is a different future, in which a culture of justice, community, and yes, efficiency could at least take root. We could be changing life instead of always grumbling on the sidelines.
I repeat, they were buying their jobs, not history.
What makes you so sure that there's no other way of seeing this story? That we've run out of alternatives? Because according to you, history has ended. Well, of course, the validity of this judgment depends on where you place yourself. Remember this?
Have you ever seen any of your victims?
You know, I never feel comfortable on these sort of things. Victims? I'd be melodramatic. Look down there. Would you really feel any pity if one of those dots stopped moving forever? If I offered you 20,000 pounds for every dot that stopped, would you really, old man, tell me to keep my money? Or would you calculate how many dots you could afford to spare? Free of income tax, old man. Free of income tax.
What makes it possible for Harry Lime? His thinking reminds me of yours, to speak these lines and still not lose our sympathy. It's not just Orson Welles' charm. Imagine the film was not so accommodating to Harry Lime's point of view. Imagine it actually showed us the faces of his potential victims. Harry Lime would become intolerable and the story would collapse. For his story to work, ordinary people like his victims must remain invisible. In the same way, for you to claim our history has ended, you have to make other stories invisible, namely those dots who, according to you, are still trapped in ancient history.
If you speak fast enough, perhaps you'll not notice that the politics on which you hang so much hope has vanished. Yes, okay, I'm here, but it's an illusion for you to think that by getting any closer to the dots, you will be able to see some shape with its own clear political destiny. Words like community, class, and solidarity have gone, and there is no way you can make them rise like Lazarus by intoning pieties over their corpse. There are periods in history, and we're in one of them now, when events move much faster than language and thinking can keep up with. So we're left speechless, or else we use a language that no longer connects with reality. All we can do is identify what we have to give up, and the first thing we have to wave goodbye to is that itch always to make maps and projects to guide our lives by.
And you don't think that what you've just said involves making a map? A Harry Lime map?
Don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. Well, what the fella said. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Karlin.
Actually, I'm all for cuckoo clock politics. I've got nothing against a minor story. But it's your swallowing it up in old histories and traditions I can't stand. Why are socialists still so conservative, so fearful of not being able to live without their all-encompassing maps? Isn't that what we always wanted? Think about those days in '68. We were both part of that desire to break free from those big machines, be they political or industrial. We hated machine politics. We hated politics with its full array of predetermined maps. So what happened to those libertarian dreams?
Maybe what happened was this.
We've created a model here. What miners are looking for is to actually take control of their own lives and actually run their own pits.
The workers are going to have the majority of control how Thurcroft is worked, and I'm sure that could be a benchmark for the rest of the industry.
It gave me some insight into what it is to sort of try and seriously run an industry or run a mine as regards where you were going to sell the coal, how you were going to run the pit, how the pit was going to be structured, what the hierarchies were going to be, who was going to be telling who what to do, and what constraints they had on if they went too far.
This story, at least, will survive. But it's what happened above ground to your libertarian ideas that really needs looking at. How these ideas made their strange reappearance. Once upon a time, two libertarian thinkers, whilst arguing, got lost. Increasingly panicked at not being able to find their way back, they met a sweet little lady gathering flowers in a clearing. She offered to show them the way out, and dazzled by her presence and thankful for small mercies, they followed her. But when sweetness and light turned into mischief and devilry, and in some cases sheer sadism, the thinkers became totally helpless. In order to convince themselves that there was absolutely nothing they could do, they decided, with her help, to turn themselves into children. The smaller and weaker they could become, the more they could blame her and so justify their helplessness. When, after a long journey, they finally reached home, to make sure that they could not be blamed for getting lost, they told the story of this woman, and they painted as black and powerful a picture of her as they could. A superpower, a witch, a Batwoman, a Victorian empress, a creator of the New World Order, an eagle, Lenin in drag. The more monstrous they could make her, the greater validity had their alibi. To all of us, then, it was more comfortable to regard Thatcher as the sole instigator of Thatcherism. But we all knew that during all that time something else was moving all along, albeit unconscious. Namely that need to turn history's pages, otherwise we felt the story would stop. By mythologizing her and venting our fury on her, we hid the fact that we were using her to get our own rethinking underway. We assigned to her so much power, we spent so much time thinking about her, that we forgot our own libertarian traditions. Now, of course, we are at least free to be a series of dots, free to speak, to imagine, as long as it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference to our status as dots. All we're then left with is accepting once again that it's only a very rigged idea of chance that will determine what will survive or not.
It's just like somebody's just sort of trampling on a part of your life, really. But you knew that it's totally unnecessary. I mean, the term industrial vandalism, I mean, this is industrial vandalism. I mean, they get on to young kids for painting, spray painting walls, but I mean, this is, if, you know, they don't get arrested for doing this kind of thing. And this is a pit with at least 20 years life.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, forces us to look at all this destruction and waste and say that things could not have been done differently.
A simply ended his argument by stating that it was precisely because there was a lack of vision, a map, if you will, that the wholesale destruction they had just witnessed would just go on and on. And if Zed was going to present his story, it should at least take account of this problem and not deny its existence. During a short break from their argument, Zed had looked at A's story of the mine. And while sharing A's feelings about its destruction, he could not see how, in these times, a socialist vision would solve such a long-term problem, or indeed, how a socialist vision could be redeemed by sending miners back down a pit. For Zed, other questions had to be asked, different answers looked for. But before starting his argument, he wanted to show his opponent an image, an emblem for his ideas.
All that I'm going to show you comes with the proviso that what will follow should not be seen as a political map. Remember also that everything you're about to see has been chosen by someone for whom the opposite of what they call a dreamer is not the practical.
To justify his unwillingness to give A the kind of answer he wanted to the questions raised by the miner's story, Zed recalled a time when he had come to the conclusion that all forms of political map-making and all-encompassing visions had really become a dead weight on the brain. How it became clear to him that the only way to retain one's sanity was to totally withdraw from all those past political obsessions with all their attendant agendas, expectations and disappointments. So he explained to A how, in trying to protect himself against what had become by now a feeling of almost terminal void, he had willed himself to another space, one that had as little to do with where he was as possible. A space where the individual really did have some chance of being empowered, so utterly unlike the space he now found himself in which an all too suffocating and paralyzing culture was being ushered in. Yes, A's story of the miners and their hopes had offered a glimpse of an alternative space, but Zed wanted to see if he could tell a different kind of story, one which would point towards a radically new kind of space rather than a space which just restaged the same old ideas. Maybe then, Zed said to A, what was more appropriate to these in-between times was not a single apocalyptic vision, but rather a glimpse of a small but real change about to come. That's the story he wanted to tell.
A mortgage to pay or rent to pay, wife and 2 children, food to put on the table, employers, trade unions if you like, who negotiate your wage rises, government policy, VAT, taxes, bills, all that kind of thing. I'd always been in low-paid employment. That's getting just over £100 a week. I'd got no qualifications.
Before you raise any of your usual objections, imagine this as a place where your dreamt of revolution has actually taken place and where a new one is beginning.
basically argues that the site of production is no longer the site of power. Right. That's gone. That's finished. And what's left is a growing, ever-increasing number of individuals who are not only incapable of seizing power, but have no interest in doing so, or no wish to do so. The traditional working class is now no more than a privileged minority, a barrier towards new thinking about class and liberation.
There's got to be something happens in people's lives, something drastic, whether it's being unemployed or they've got to come to a stage where they can see no future and say, I'm either going to change or I'm going to carry on as I am with no future whatsoever.
Industrial production is not going away from the world. There might be a shift from manufacturing to services in advanced capitalism, but there's no shift from manufacturing to services in third world. And therefore, you know, working class is growing in third world, the industrial working class.
That's a very Eurocentric view.
Yeah.
Because at one time, if you looked at a council estate, you'd find that a lot of people on the council estate were employed in the same job, getting the same money, involved with the same social activity. But now you've got sort of such varying degrees of a sort of the social strata, as you call it, on council estate. You might have one that's a miner, you might have one that's a technical manager, you'll have somebody that owns a Porsche. And so even the communities are broken up, so you haven't even got that strength there to work on.
It's a place that's conducive to learning. The serenity, if you like, of the place, the room, the solitude. Not being isolated permanently, but being able for days on end to get away and just do what I wanted to do. We all know the idea of new technology was to allow people more space, more time, more leisure to do what they wanted. But my experience is that if people have got more time, but not a deal of finances to enjoy it with, the only kind of space people get is to sit down and think about whether they're going to be able to pay bills or the standard of living or what they can do for the kids or even for themselves. And that's not real space. That's a waste of space.
We're still talking along lines in which most people are in full-time work and members of their trade unions. It ain't like that anymore, is it?
I mean, I think it's vital that people go to institutions like Northern College or some kind of higher education. But not just for the education, for the space that they get.
When I asked you to rethink your disavowal of politics, I was talking about those political structures that collide with and can ruin people's lives. Obviously, it's desirable for an individual to grab any chance he can to get an education for himself. God knows there have been countless struggles to force capitalism to give some space to these endeavours. But what I don't see is how all this can help those who are left to fight it out in isolation and with no defence.
Remember the emblem I showed you at the beginning. Look at it again. Bear it in mind when I say that I cannot, will not draw you a political map. Everything to me points in several ways at once. I'm only trying to indicate some points where, because all systems are coming up against their limits, opportunities for different ways of thinking are bound to occur. In any case, I haven't finished yet.
Graphs there. I'd hated it at school anyway. It had just been like a production line, kids in at one end and kids out at other, into factories, and that were it. And then when I came here on Monday morning and we went into the first session, I couldn't believe that you could talk. Everybody was just sat round a table and you could actually talk and discuss and feed off each other.
Look, both the politics of socialism and capitalism focus on the idea of capturing the commanding heights of the economy. Both set of politics depended on a world order, control, stability. This dream has gone.
Had a job for a few years, got married, had kids. Usual things, what everybody were expected to do. And then I just found that I wanted something else. It weren't enough. I mean, everything was nice, but it just weren't enough. And I had never written anything for 15 years since I'd left school, and actually putting pen to paper for the first time, and I wrote a one-page essay, and I had to read it out on Friday morning. We used to go around class, and my knees were shaking and my stomach was churning.
Works councils represent the entire workforce.
They represent.
They've got certain legal obligations to cooperate and work with the employers.
All I remember of that moment is the screeching of brakes and someone's scream. I have no idea what happened after that until I awoke in a strange bed surrounded by people. The nurse said I was very lucky. The car hadn't been going very fast, and there had been a young man on the scene who knew what to do. "Oh, here he is," she said. "He said he'd come in to see you when you were awake." I couldn't believe it. He was there, at my bedside, looking into my face, expressionless, threatening, and much too close.
It's unfinished, but left it open in the sense of, uh-oh,
Yes,
what now?
that's a nice ending, I think.
Yeah, I think it's really good, yeah.
You can put your own bit on after that. You can think it through yourself, can't you?
You know, like people were saying before, it just needed something to, you know, to keep suspense up, and then just a punch at end. And to think, I mean, it's ironic that this place is used now to educate working class people, when it was once this aristocratic family that lived here. But this is my space.
So, complaint against the government of El Salvador. Complaint against the government of...
We're talking about the consciousness, getting out of a routine, getting out of the security, if you like, of life. That a man has to get a job, has to go to work. A woman, possibly a housewife, bringing up kids. Once you've left school, that's the end of that. You go out and you get a job. Probably routine jobs or job to retirement, and then end of story. And the politics of today say that.
Ready? One more. No hands there.
I'm not doing it for individual gain. I'm not doing it for an individual purpose, but I think what I'm doing at the moment has to be done as an individual for society to change.
This way. Okay.
Oh, no.
Tea break back at 20 past, yeah?
Yeah. Past.
What? 20 past.
You're going to be buried in that jacket.
This story may not turn your world upside down, but if I'm asking you to look at all this, it's because of what faces us when we can no longer rely on a political system to serve us, or even inspire in us a need to think of something better. So all we're left with is ourselves. I take no pleasure in the devastation caused by constant change, but why always put yourself in the position of having to defend the past? Why defend mining as a way of life? If there is a sign of a new won freedom, is that freedom to create one's own life. There is no longer any central determining power. You know that. Rather, what I'm talking about is a power that is scattered, decentralized, difficult to focus on and fight.
And so we're right back in your zone of turbulence, that play of randomness and chance which you confuse with freedom. A freedom which, I repeat, the politics of today can deliver, but only in very limited editions. But when it comes to thinking about political change, according to you, we're either enthralled by capital or we're bent down by it. Chaos, which for you is a source of endless philosophical fascination and possibilities, but for others is nothing but a series of bloody ruins and suffering.
Remember the emblem.
Your version of the Holy Grail.
Look again. Look, we could do no worse than asking what questions they asked to get their kind of answer. To welcome some absurdity in our every gesture would at least be a start in knowing how to deal with change. We would be able to incorporate change into our very being, rather than always seeing it as an invasion or threat from outer space. It's that emphasis on fixing meaning that brings with it control, supremacy, hierarchy.
It's not the idea of fixing meaning that's at fault. It's who's fixing those meanings and why. I asked you to take account of the fact that because there is no vision, there are no maps, destruction and chaos will go on and on. You come back with an answer that we just have to go with the flow, as if you have no part in creating this flow. It's very easy to say all this from those heights where you seem to have taken up permanent residence.
But at least I'm not summoning, commanding, or imposing.
And so their argument paused. They both knew they had come to some kind of an ending, and that the period for ritual combats was finished. They also knew that the time of being seduced by dreams without really ever having to achieve them was also over. However confused they were, they had to come to a decision as to whether they were in fact living in new times or not. So, as if with one last throw of the dice, they decided to take a journey that would bring them to the very edge of these strange and puzzling in-between times. They came to a place which brought to their minds all those discussions they'd heard about the changing nature of work. A place which would allow them to see whether a future was indeed in the making, or whether what they were seeing was just the same old past that was being recycled, albeit in a strange form.
Can you catch up with the weekend? Okay, that's perfect.
It's a good job to do at home because you can fit it in around school hours and children's cat naps and still be a housewife and a mum at home.
Don't worry about being slow on this. Most important thing is picking up those the codes and the editor's marks. Okay? Keep an eye on it. Sure.
If I were to revive my taste for political dreams, I would say that the point of economic life should not be to increase production for the sake of it, but to increase free time. Obviously, we're not anywhere near it, but this is the foundation for it. And if you're telling me that this is daydreaming, let me say to you that utopian fictions are nothing but stories waiting to become true. The basic question is how we can think of a politics for the redemption of time.
Another lady, her husband is away and his weekend is Mondays and Tuesdays, so this job suits her because her weekend changes to Mondays and Tuesdays and she keys when she likes over Saturday and Sunday. No, she couldn't do that with an ordinary job.
But it's the first time I've been able to work in Cornwall, which is my home, in my life, because you can see lots of young people here. And they haven't had to go away to London or Birmingham to find a job, you know, they're sort of getting some technology and sticking with it here.
Every time you show me a picture of the future, you manage to make the present we're all living in invisible. Well, I say, to me this is not a post-industrial dream palace. It's a factory, a word factory, which for some also extends into their home.
You really do have to allow yourself to admit just how radically things have changed. Today it's no longer a question of winning power as a worker, but of winning the power no longer to function as a worker. And I repeat, this is the foundation for it.
You again, Paul. You should have dressed today. Melanie, you're next.
You have to look at all this as also being an in-between time. As soon as there is a machine invented to replace all this work, these workers will be discarded by history, just as surely were the miners and the shipbuilders. For the moment, though, I can't see any liberation from work, and it's no use dressing up that fact with your fiction of control. The work, under whosever control, is beyond redemption. All you can do is limit its time, so that a life can exist outside of work.
010 in your file name, that's for the 100s only. It will count the number of occurrences of that, and that should tally up with, in the end, when you put in the numbers.
I'll tell you if you got your right.
And it'll tell you if you've got your right count. Right?
What is being made here is knowledge. With the possibility of more free time in the future, this knowledge could be used by people who in the past would have had no access to it. On one disk, you can have Samuel Johnson's dictionary, Jane Austen's novels, cross-reference it with history, economics. You can participate in a creation of knowledge. That's the culture we have to encourage, a culture of becoming and not simply being content with who we are.
You really are amazing. One minute, you're explaining that we have no reliable language, no way of charting the future. The next minute, you're waving around the most incredible of utopian maps, devoid of any historical or political sites.
How many times have you heard people saying, there must be more to life than this, without ever really asking where that more can be located? Isn't that the question that really should be asked?
At this point, I realized that neither A nor Z would be able to reach any kind of conclusion on their own, as well as being those not quite fictional characters who lived in this unsure storyteller's head. Their arguments had been hampered by their narrator's sense of living in a in-between time. Any possible conclusion, then, would have to take into account that the longer their arguments had gone on, the more their differences had become blurred.
Listening to you, I think of a strike that took place in France in 1967. The strikers were not just asking for better wages, but for a different life. I can still see that poster on the wall, which said wages, yes, but laughs, theatre, culture and life. And I can still hear the strike leader saying how they had donated their savings to other strikers and asking the interviewer, isn't that also culture?
The irony is that at the time, dream language could still be spoken. Now that we have the means to make these dreams possible, we no longer know how to speak it.
Speaking between the voices, and having been stretched between the various borders that existed between A and Z, the narrator had at least learnt, through their arguments, that this in-between time and in-between space did not represent a no-man's land or a no-man's time. It was a real land and a real time.
What I'd like to see, I think there was a possibility that we could have made some kind of progress on that at Thurcroft, is that the lads actually go to work because they're quite happy to go to work. And the job that they're doing, they feel involved in, they get paid for it well, and they go home at night and think that, and don't feel completely shagged out and fed up with the world, but they feel more positive about the world.
You start to question your own life and is it enough, and what can you do? What can you do to better things for yourself individually and then in community?
it's also set in my mind some doubt as to whether the beliefs I've got could ever be achieved. The power of capital comes across since its inception over 250 years ago is immense.
As for the storyteller, he realized that he needed to be part of that land. After all, its very survival had helped him to confront that sleepy logic, so beloved by governments and gods, which states that the world is just the way it is because there is no other way it could be. So he decided to keep his voices, make them argue, merge, split again, be on high and on the ground. Anything to keep that sleepy logic at bay. But then there were those who had been doing this all along.